Hello and welcome everybody. Sorry about that. Okay. Welcome everybody to our records education series. This is your place for tips and best practices to help strengthen your abilities with your software. My name is Marcia Shields and I'm from our customer success team. I'll be your host, and joining me today is Jeff Dunning, who will be your subject matter expert. We're happy to have you with us, whether you're joining us live or watching this recording later. In today's session, Jeff will be reviewing mapping metadata to retention rules. Next slide, please, Jeff. Thank you. So a few housekeeping items just to keep us and everybody honest. Our session will run for about 30 minutes today, and there will be plenty of time at the end for any questions that you might have. Questions are certainly encouraged, and at the bottom of your Zoom bar, you'll see the Q&A area. You could post your questions there. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and I'll tee those up for Jeff after he's done with his presentation. As a reminder, you probably heard, we are recording the session and it will be shared after today's event. Next slide, please, Jeff. Okay, just a reminder, or for anybody new to 2026, we did an all-star program last year, which we are continuing for this year as well. What that means is for any education session that you attend or surveys we may send out after, you earn points. And once you get to 3,000 points, you will get to our Gimmal, our Morae Education All-Star Badge. And I will be revealing what the new badge looks like for 2026 very soon. I have that. To get us started today, I'm going to post a quick poll question for our audience to get some feedback. If you wouldn't mind taking a minute. The question today is, are you using metadata to determine record class today? And I'll give that a second, Jeff, and then I'll share results out.
All right.
Get a few people in there. I got some answers coming in. Get a couple more. I think that will be a good tee up for today's topic. It's really close between all of them. Maybe a couple more people can. Yep, there we go. Thank you. And let's see if we can get just a couple more. Okay. Okay, let me share this out. And Jeff, can you see the answers? So for those who can't see all the answers, the options were no in some specific instances, for almost all classes, and for the entirety of our record schedule. And it looks like in some specific instances wins at 43% of the audience.
Follows what I see when I have conversations out there. So I'm not surprised what I see there, which is kind of interesting.
All right. All right, Jeff. That's it for me. I'm going to hand things off to you.
All right. Thanks so much, Marcia.
You bet.
All right. So let's just jump in here real quick. As we have this conversation here, people attending today, we kind of understand retention schedules, legal defensibility, your regulatory obligations. We don't need to really talk about that, right? We don't tend to struggle with policy design. It's really operationalizing retention at scale. And I think that's where most of our customers and most of the people that I'm talking to are really kind of struggling in kind of the whole concept of records, right? So today we're going to focus on metadata, how that functions and is used as the enforcement mechanism inside records, to map that metadata to retention rules so that we can support all those challenges we have around defensibility, consistency, and audit readiness type stuff, right? So let's just take a quick look at some things. And first, we'll talk a little bit about kind of why retention kind of fails in practice. What are some of the things that are happening around retention in practice, right? It's really about missing schedules or kind of not of the date passing and us not doing it. It's usually about these three things. A, the records aren't being classified, so we're just not properly classifying records. We're missing records for whatever reasons. We're trying to do classification on inconsistent metadata, right? Metadata that's not the same across the board, and we'll talk about reasons why some of that is happening, and then metadata never really activating retention triggers, especially around the event-based stuff, right? So we're not filling in contract end date or whatever that date or whatever that piece of information we need to kind of start the clock, right? So um, in records, in Gimmal records, retention's only as strong as the metadata that we use to classify the records. If that metadata is incomplete, ambiguous, right, retention then becomes inconsistent, which introduces all that risk, right? So really, the question that we really are kind of trying to answer is what metadata is truly required to defensively apply retention, right? So that's the goal when we start looking at the metadata, especially when we're using records here, is what is that data that is truly required, right? We don't want to over have it, we don't want to under have it. We need to really understand kind of what it is that we need. So what is that metadata that how does it kind of work there, right? I think the best way to think about it is it's not descriptive. We got to stop thinking of metadata as being descriptive and think of it more as a control mechanism, right? It's a mechanism for effectively controlling those records. It typically answers questions like, what record class does this belong to? What function or business activity created it? And when does retention begin? So if we start using our metadata to answer those questions, that control mechanism around those questions, we start getting that consistency that we're looking for, right? And in most programs, we just need a few kind of pieces of information. We got to capture the category or class, right? So what category or class that's in, and we typically Gimmal records will apply that based on the rules we assign around other kind of metadata, the business function, the content or record type, which is super helpful when we use a lot of our what I would call our semi-structured kind of environments. Like if we're in the SharePoint world and stuff like that, content types are super helpful in helping us understand record types and things like that. And then our event or our cutoff date, right? What's going to start that clock? We start capturing too much, we lose clarity, we lose the kind of being precise in our classifications, and that's where things get a little bit unwieldy when we're trying to do this. And that's kind of where a lot of stuff falls because we get that we kind of get that gray area, right? So sometimes things start falling across the gray area. We see that a lot in electronic records when we're trying to manage electronic content, that things become a little gray because we have so much metadata and we build these rules. And then that gray area comes in where this piece of metadata, if that value is X, it could be here and it could be here, and that precision starts to go away. So if we can shorten those lists, answer those questions that we just spoke about, right? What record class does it belong to? The business, when does retention begin? And keep our metadata focused to that, we do a lot better of a job of then assigning the category or class. And then once we can assign that category and class, everything kind of follows, right? So the category has a life cycle and a life cycle has a retention, and we kind of fall through that whole kind of workflow of things happening. So the metadata can really drive that. We got to make sure that we're precise and consistent on that. So how does Gimmal kind of enforce the logic around the metadata there, right? It's very structured in how it does. So metadata maps content to a record class. So something in that metadata value. And the metadata value for this mapping part here is different based on kind of where you are storing your content, right? What target system that content exists in? Because again, the big driver of Gimmal Records is that we manage that content in place, right? So if it's in Box, we're going to manage it in Box. If it's in a file share, we're going to manage it in a file share. So we want to make sure that we have some kind of information there that helps us get to that class. That information can be, a content type we talked about. It could be a folder if we're in file shares because we're a little bit kind of, hampered there. and the list goes on of how we can do that. And then record classes are associated with the record schedules, and then the schedules define the duration and the triggers associated with that, right? So we don't interpret the policy language. It's all logic, right? If metadata indicates a record's a vendor contract, the record system will apply the associated retention rule, such as retain for 7 years. That's why it's very clear because it's very logical. We get into those gray areas and it's not that clear. That's where things kind of fall out of whack there. So we really have to have that metadata kind of be consistent so we can follow that logic that we just talked about, right? And that defensible mapping approach has to include which metadata fields determine the record class. So what are we going to use to determine that, right? Allowable values, we want to get away from free text. This is an important point here, right? The more we can standardize the allowed values and get away from free text, the better we're going to be. A typo is not going to help us do anything defensively. So pick list, allowable values, character checking. If it's a date, make sure that the date is formatted correctly. Those kinds of things. Having that kind of check and this metadata is going to help us be a little bit more consistent. That's a very important point in there. The more we can use pull downs and checking of that type of stuff, right? Values map directly to the record classes, and then think of it this way: a metadata field maps to a value, that value maps to a record class, and that record class maps to a retention rule. If we think of that kind of flow there, that's how Gimmal Records kind of works, right? If that piece of metadata does not clearly resolve to that single record class, retention will become subjective, and then our, ability to be auditable and defensible and all those other things, it just doesn't work there anymore. So that's kind of how that path works. Metadata field gets a value, that value maps to a record class, that record class maps to a retention rule, is the way the flow kind of works there. Automation. The more we can automate, the better. That's a pretty simple statement. I think we all feel that same way in this space, is that with records, with Gimmal records, once we can define those rules and we get them right, that automation is going to run. And for the most part, we don't have to do a whole lot there, right? We're going to monitor the unclassified, which is going to help us really kind of lock down our rules. So kind of when you think about an onboarding and a process that goes forward, is we're going to do these metadata mappings. We're going to get metadata field to value, gets our classes. We're going to get the stuff that's in the gray area, the things that we miss for whatever reasons. We're going to get that in our unclassified kind of bucket, and we're constantly going to be tweaking that process. Okay, how do we make that rule a little bit better? How do we get that metadata to be more consistent? Do we have to add a value to the pick list? Is there something that's not working? Is there something that's not getting picked up properly? And what do our rules look like? So that's going to kind of happen over time, because we really want to get to that automation level as quickly as we can to get that stuff under control, right? Our defensibility kind of is based on the fact that we're best effort, like we're really trying. All our stuff is kind of falling in the spaces. We don't have these big buckets of stuff that's falling out, that's unclassified, that's missing retention because of whatever the reason might be, right? And then we have to validate our event-based triggers are populated. Are we putting in contract end dates? Are we putting in termination dates of employees? Whatever those are, what are those event-based triggers? How are they being populated? And how can we automate those functions? How can we get that data to kind of push over automatically so we know we're getting it consistently on time, in the right places on a regular basis? So that automation piece there around the event-based triggers, because most of them are coming from someplace else, and we got to figure out ways to kind of get them in there. And then our periodic reviews of kind of really how we're going there, right? So governance doesn't end at implementation. It requires an ongoing ownership of that kind of space. So someone has to own that, someone has to review it regularly. Things change, things get added, and we have to make sure that our records are following that kind of space in there. Some of the pitfalls, really, we talked a lot about this stuff as I was kind of going through here, but overly granular record classes causes confusion and inconsistent classification, right? So we get really down into granularity of our record categories. And if we don't have the proper metadata to support that, to answer those questions we were talking about a little bit earlier, then we're going to really get that inconsistent classification, or we're really going to get people confused about how anything is kind of working. And once we get people that are uncertain, we don't have that confidence in the system, everything kind of snowballs from there, right? So we get people questioning, are we managing our records correctly? Are we deleting the right things? And then once we start having those questions being asked, right, the program starts to fall apart. People don't want things to be deleted. Then we're having a hard time implementing the things we want to implement, and we kind of go there. So if we don't, first recommendation would be don't be over granular with our record classes, but this isn't a series about your retention schedule. I think what this is more about is make sure that we have that mapped to minimal metadata, specific metadata that defines that in the location it's going to exist. And that's the other important part, right? Is make sure that we have the rules for each one of those locations that exists. So you may have a record class that exists in different repositories based on location or offices or business unit or whatever the case might be. So you have to make sure that you map for each one of those repositories. So if repository equals file share, this is the mapping for that particular record class. If repository equals SharePoint, this would be the mapping. And if repository equals file share, this would be the mapping. And Gimmal Records allows you to have those multiple mappings for a single record class. So those rules to map to that metadata, there could be many for a single record class, and those can change based on repository and where that content is stored. So we got to think about where are the locations that those particular record classes will exist and make sure those rules are consistent across there. Event-based retention with the right event dates. This is really one of the biggest areas where stuff gets lost, is we are not bringing over those event dates. More and more of our records are tied to these dates, right? So much stuff has a date trigger, not just a doc was approved on this date. It's more of a date trigger, right? Employee terminated, contract end, so forth and so on, right? We got to make sure that we're getting those dates, and those dates it can't be a process where say, oh, someone in HR is responsible for going in and setting that date in SharePoint or wherever that record exists. Those kind of processes have a tendency to break for a tons of reasons, right? Something we're not going to be able to fix. What we can fix is saying, okay, those dates exist someplace. How do we get those dates to where we need those dates reliably, on time, and consistently? And once we can do that, again, we can then our event-based stuff will work better, and we'll have more confidence in it, right? Legacy content predates current metadata standards. We're always going to have a problem with legacy data, older data. Also with kind of file share data, that's where things get a little bit harder. We don't have the same metadata standards we have in, say, a SharePoint or a Box or those kind of repositories. We kind of struggle a little bit in our file share data. Stuff we can use, file names, folders, stuff like that. We have to be a little bit more creative in that space, but we got to fully understand that we have those risks with that legacy content in those types of repositories, and we have to really focus on that and be really concise there. And if that means kind of changing some structures, maybe migrating some stuff around so we can change folder names and things like that, then let's kind of do that. But understand that that takes a little bit more. That legacy content is going to be a little bit harder there, right? Our record team's owning the policy, but not the metadata decisions. And really, what that talks about is the policy, and maybe they kind of own both. But what we don't want to do is we don't want our policy to force or kind of have a defining decision on the metadata side of the house. And with that, I mean is policies shouldn't determine, say, here's a policy, and the policy says we got to capture these 7 fields for whatever we want, right? Policies shouldn't dictate those 7 fields. Policy on a records team is I have a contract. I need to keep the contract for 7 years after the contract end date. And then the metadata decisions are going to be based, how do I answer those 3 questions? Not because policy says we need you to capture all this information about the contract, right? We want to kind of get away from policy driving these big long list of metadata because that's really what's happening in a lot of organizations. They'll say, okay, we got a record, it's called a contract. I need to track these 12 fields about that contract, right? Kind of who's the supplier, what's the value, all that. I'm not, when I'm doing records, I'm not worried about any of that kind of stuff. What's that singular piece of metadata that's going to tell me it's a contract? And what's that singular piece of metadata that's going to tell me when does the clock start? That's what I'm focused on. And I want to make sure that I stay focused there and I don't worry about all the other kind of stuff. So that's kind of what we kind of talk about when we talk about policy and metadata and separating them out there. Design metadata with defensibility in mind. Make sure our governance is connected fully with type of stuff. I'm a big fan of good enough over perfection. Let's make sure things get in a bucket and don't just sit out there because we're trying to really be perfect or we're trying to say, I'm going to have this record class called ABC, and under ABC, I'm going to minimize it down to be like 5 different, really tiny, very specific buckets. How about we just stick with ABC, right? Like how about we stick with a contract record class versus, I don't know, different contracts, right? Oil contract, water contract, like boom, boom, boom. Like, don't get that granular. Let's kind of get to a point where we can really kind of make this work for us as we go through. So it's kind of what we're doing today with our customers that, our Gimmal record customers to get it to a point where we're doing those classifications and we're getting that confidence. I think for me, what we're really shooting for is the confidence the system is working how they need it to work so that they are defensible, they can get audited, and they know it's happening the way they want it to happen. So, key takeaways, last thing, and then we'll have some questions. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to stick them in the question box there. But couple key takeaways there. The importance of the design. Take some time up front, go through the design, information architectures, what we call it. Make sure that is high quality, well governed. It's just like time has been spent thinking through it. And there's a second side of this, and that's kind of the user community side. Like it's got to be easy as well, right? It's got to be easily adoptable by the end users. If you're asking the end users to do something to add a piece of metadata, we got to make that a little bit easier, right? The logic of the mapping stuff should be a records professional stuff. So as records professionals, we should be kind of involved in all that work in those mappings and that logic and stuff like that. IT and the business might need 12 metadata fields. We need to focus on the 2 that's important to us. And we need to make sure that we stand strong in saying we need 2 fields to do this, and they need to be concise and consistent, and they need to be pick list or value checkers and for dates and stuff like that. Like let's push our needs to make sure that our 2 fields, if they want free form for provider name or whatever the case might be, so be it. I'm not going to use it, but where I'm going to use them, let's make sure we have all that validation there. Standardization is going to help us across the board. If it looks the same, no matter what the record is, it just makes things a little bit easier to do. So the more it could be similar in nature, standardization of terms. If we use end date for contracts, we should use end date in other places. Whatever that terminology is, it should be rather consistent so everybody kind of knows what we want. And then we also want people to be able to pick up on this over time, right? It's one thing to implement it, but it's an ongoing process and there's going to be new people coming and going. It should be easily adoptable across the board there, right? And sustainable. Make sure that it's kind of something that can continue to work with the organization. It's not going to get outdated. It's not very manual where the manual effort just keeps getting harder and harder and harder. And it's not a process where we're not getting the effect we want. At the end of the day, there's a few things that matter the most when you really talk about this, right? It's end user adoption. If we're going to ask the end user to do stuff, it's got to be simple, easy, consistent. We can't explain it every single time, right? So the information architecture you use has to be adoptable there. It's got to be consistent and it's got to support confidence. If we don't have confidence in our program, it's going to be hard for people to get it done. When I go into organizations and we see that, content is, we see the content sprawl, we see things like, hey, like I noticed that the contracts here for your whatever, right, for your IT services, they're all here, and that's where you're trying to do your records work on them. But I find all those same contracts over here in a different location. Why is that? And it's because people don't have confidence in what we're doing. They don't want to put them there because they're afraid they're going to lose them before they're supposed to lose them. So they're making copies of them, and our risk just kind of grows and grows um, from that space on. So I think those are the three biggest points. If you can answer those three questions with metadata that we stated early, I think you'll be, from a Gimmal Records perspective, you'll be well on your way to being able to implement the stuff and managing your records. Marsha, I think that's it for me. We go to
Hey,
questions. Got
thanks,
anything
Jeff.
for
Yeah,
me?
great stuff. Yeah, we do have a couple from the audience here. So the first one is, does the metadata have to be consistent across repositories when you have the different repositories?
No, that's one of the beauties of Gimmal Records is that we have the ability to have multiple rule sets within a single kind of class there, right? So we can say, okay, for employee records, which we may keep in different repositories, say I got, file share, SharePoint, and Box. In that kind of rule set there, you could have multiple rules. I kind of talked a little bit about it earlier. And we could say, okay, if the repository equals file shares, we're going to look for a folder called HR and a folder called whatever, like employee name or something like that, right? So we're going to look for that, and that's going to be the rule. Oh, if I'm in Box, I'm going to look for a content type of HR record, and that's going to be my trigger there. And oh, if I'm in SharePoint, I'm going to have a rule that says if this metadata field equals this value. So in Gimmal Records, we get multiple rules for that one particular thing, which is really nice. It gives us that ability because in most organizations, records are scattered all over. They're not always all kept in one place.
Great. Okay. And then the other question, and if you do have questions, audience, the Q&A area is best to post that. But the second question we have, Jeff, is when you were talking about file shares, how the metadata is limited when it came in. The question is, what are some common metadata that you see used from customers when dealing with file shares?
Yeah, so a lot of it is location, right? And I think all of us that have used file shares for long time before all this new stuff, SharePoint and all these other type of semi-structured repositories came out, um, we use folder names for kind of information about the content, right? So we would give a folder name and it would say, this is, employee record, and then I would have my employee records in there. And then maybe I use a file name and I use file names and I start my file name or I have some kind of naming convention where I start the file name with maybe the employee number, right? The first five numbers is the employee number of that employee that that file associates with. So typically file names and folders are what's used there. We do have a lot of dates that we could use for the clock work, right? Create dates, modify dates, stuff like that that we can use, but we're a little hindered in that space. So we really have to kind of think about how do we use folders to kind of help concepts of like filing cabinets with folder names type of
Great.
work.
Yeah, great tip. Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah.
And you're off the hot seat. That's all the questions we have.
All right. Well,
We'll
perfect timing.
yeah, we'll go to the next slide. We'll just wrap it up for everybody today. So, thanks everybody for joining us. We hope you found this helpful. Our next session in the education series will be March 5th, and that's under our Gimmal Discover product, and we'll be talking about classification analysis, and we hope you can join us there. If you do have any suggestions for future sessions, we're always open to that. Please send those my way or to your closest Morae representative, and we'll be happy to add those to the schedule. Otherwise, we'll send this recording once it's completed, and we appreciate you joining us today, and we'll see everybody next time. Thank you.
Thanks.